Welcome to the Workology podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrell, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
This podcast, welcome, is part of a series on the Workology podcast that is focused on the roles and responsibilities of the Chief Human Resources Officer, or CHRO. We sometimes refer to the CHRO also as the Chief People Officer or the VP of Talent. The CHRO is an executive C-level role that deals with managing human resources as well as with organizational development, implementing policies of change, focused on improving the overall efficiency of the company. The CHRO podcast series on Workology is powered by my friends Daily Pay and Ginger.com. The Workology podcast is sponsored by Upskill HR and Ace the HR exam. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to do this series on the CHROs is because I feel like there's so much mystery around this role. I want aspiring Chief Human Resource Officers to know about the type of skills and experiences they need to promote into that future CHRO role. Throughout this CHRO podcast series, we have asked each guest about how they began their careers and grew into their CHRO roles. And their answers were very varied, different, and really interesting. So this podcast is including excerpts from some of our best interviews on the Workology podcast with those CHROs, VPs of HR, and Chief People Officers on how some of the most successful professionals in our industry started their careers with an eye on the leadership position.
So I did not study to be an HR guy. It's weird. I obviously talk to a lot of people in this profession, and it's not unusual to hear somebody say, I never thought I'd be an HR person. I'm one of those people. In fact, I don't even really know when I was in school whether they had kind of formal HR programs. And certainly out of Cornell's industrial and labor relations program, there were probably few out there. I actually started my career as an accountant, as a public accountant, CPA with Deloitte, and Deloitte, like many firms, was just one of those larger companies that was willing to give people, an opportunity to kind of pivot in their careers. And I had one of those opportunities almost by accident, almost by kind of maybe even by mistake. But I had a chance to go work with the firm's chief HR officer as his chief of staff, like national project manager. And I didn't know a lick about HR, but I could manage a project. So he took me under his wing for a few years, and I liked the subject matter enough that I stuck with it. And I started in the field like everybody, and was an HR business partner, and looked for experiences along the way that would, I think, prepare me for an executive role at some point. And kind of that's where I've been for the last 10 years or so. I mean, the profession has changed considerably in that time. Obviously, my work has changed considerably. I think we are, and I don't know that this is necessarily just my platform, my philosophy. I think a lot of people are experiencing this. I think we are much less programmatic than we used to be. I think we're a lot more focused on behaviors and cultivating the right experiences for the individual, not necessarily just for the workforce. I think we're relying a lot more on technology. I think we're relying a lot more on the analytics. I think we're more naturally integrated with the business. We're not fighting as hard to have a voice, which is something that you I know remember talking a lot about, maybe even just 10 years ago. So yeah, things have changed a lot.
That's a great question. So I have done, I would say, many different things in my career, both in HR, but also had opportunities to work within the business and doing some sales roles that really brought some different perspectives to my job today. And I have done some time doing people development very early in my career. Have built some recruiting teams and done some recruiting myself. Have done generalist roles, specialist roles. But I would say what really has changed how I see HR was the opportunity to work in other countries where it gave me really that perspective of being in an office, but in receiving information from headquarters, and how a lot of those communications are perceived by people who are not in headquarters. So that gave me a lot to think about it, and a lot of food for thoughts to do my job differently today.
Well, it's funny to hear you say 20 years, because I remember early in my years, like thinking, how do people have that much experience, or how do you get to the next job? Now to have somebody introduce me and say I have 20 years of experience, it's like my internal reaction is time flies, you know? I think my roles have evolved, basically just passion by loving people. So what's interesting is I have a degree in advertising, marketing, and PR in a little place called Wichita, Kansas, at Wichita State. You know, my degree wasn't in HR, but I knew early on in all the different jobs I did, starting at the bottom, that it was all about people. So looking back and thinking, like, how did I get to the chief people officer role? I think it goes back again to what I said, which was just a passion for people. And I think when you find your niche and you know what you love, that helps you get to the next role and the next role and the next role, whatever that passion might be. So it's interesting to think, you know, some of my first jobs were like folding panties at Victoria's Secret and folding clothes at the Gap, and then to, you know, open my own clothing business, to then working at the largest company in the world, Walmart, and having seven different jobs with them before coming to Torchy's. You know, I look back and I'm like, all those different jobs taught me something different that helped me be a better leader and be passionate about developing others and getting them realizing that, you know, whatever company you work for, but definitely with Torchy's, that there's opportunity for advancement. It's about developing your people, and that's where you find success, no matter what kind of role you're playing or what kind of business you're in. You know, if you have people that love their job, you develop them, you invest in them, they give back tenfold, and that's what makes your jobs, your restaurants, your businesses successful. So it's really awesome to be in that chief HR role and really be able to do that for people on a large scale and in a growing company. So I'm definitely lucky to have my role.
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller-Merrell, and you're listening to the Workology podcast, sponsored by Upskill HR and Ace the HR Exam. This episode is part of our CHRO podcast series, and it is powered by our friends at DailyPay and Ginger.com. We're sharing some of the best responses from podcast guests from our CHRO series about how they got started in HR. How did they get into that CHRO position? Where did they come from? What was their progression like?
Every employee has different mental health needs, from preventive behavioral health coaching to therapy and psychiatry. Ginger offers effective, convenient mental health care for any level of need, all from a smartphone. Learn more, visit ginger.com.
I started my career working as a recruitment consultant, and this experience allowed me to develop a lot of relevant skills, such as negotiation, project and stakeholders management, and also working with multiple industries and contexts. This was a strong start, which allowed me to grow really fast. After my consulting experience, I embraced other areas of HR as a generalist and a senior assistant, which would be similar to the business partner that we have currently in the market. And after the business partner role, it was clear to me what I would like to focus on and how important our work is towards the success of an organization. I was working at a big multinational at the time, working as a policies coordinator, but always felt that bigger companies tend to take longer to shift direction and adapt to change. That's when I turned my attention to the startup ecosystem. Working at startups is a completely different landscape. We have to roll up our sleeves and take action. Everything happens in a very fast-paced environment and a very fast-paced move. So we need to be creative enough and reinvent our people practices systematically. We always need to be paying attention to what the market is practicing and always trying to reinvent what we do. To sum it all up, in the last 20 years, I've seen traditional companies that took a very traditional approach to HR management being replaced by startups that need us to be deeply involved and that ultimately require us to be really hands-on, but also needs us to be very strategic, making sure that we support our teams in the best way possible and allow the companies to scale fast. That is the ultimate goal. The CHRO is critical for companies to succeed. And this is the main change that I've seen over the last 20 years. Ultimately, as HR professionals, we also have to reinvent ourselves to keep up with the growing needs of the global market, but also the acknowledgement that our contribution towards company success is definitely stronger now. At least that's how I feel it. And this is a bit of my story and how I have evolved so far in terms of my HR background. And for sure, I see a lot of changes when it comes to how the HR role is perceived by the companies and towards the success and growth of a company.
You know, my background really starts with, I actually have a degree in HR and even got a master's in HRIR from the University of Minnesota. So I've always wanted to be in HR and take that next step. I've had a variety of roles throughout my career, and I wouldn't change a thing with it. I started in an HR service center right out of college, and that was a great background to everything. It was payroll, it was benefits, employee issues, all those pieces that you had, and then moved around. And being at Adelina through their healthcare organization was fantastic because you were able to move around and have all these different experiences. And I do believe that that's what makes the HR leader that I am today, is to have been in all these different roles and to work with these different functions. And I would say too, I had great champions and mentors. The boss that I had as I moved into my generalist role, she really pushed me to move into a generalist role and do that. And then the vice president of human resources at the time, where I was making a decision whether or not to stay at Adelina or move on to Lawson. And she's like, you need to get other experiences too, which, you know, helped push as well. She wasn't pushing me out the door, but it was great to like have someone to support you through your career in that. And so, I mean, each of the roles that I've taken have like brought these different aspects to my HR career, where you had pay and benefits at the beginning. And then Lawson really brought in this public global organization where I supported and partnered with the general managers for these 3 different verticals that were global, supporting sales and services teams and really having that proverbial HR seat at the table, which really prepared me for the roles that I went into at Ceridian as we transitioned through the places that they were in at that point in time, raising employee engagement, changing the culture that was there, bringing 2 organizations together, and then ultimately leading to that role in product. And finally, where it really came down to, and the end game has always been to be a CHRO. It's been my goal. It's been my dream. I even remember my college professor at the University of St. Thomas asking, you specifically want to be a chief HR officer at X company? And I'm like, yeah, why not? I can do it. So I think, you know, being here at DataSite is like the culmination of all these different experiences that I've had. And I love the fact that everything I've learned and the leaders that I've had in my life and the mentors that have been there have helped shape this experience. And I can bring to DataSite to bring this, you know, how change and transformation and an amazing employee experience to the DataSite team.
One of the most important things I think I did that helped with my HR career is I studied HR when I was in college, and I had a Professor Joe Cox at Baylor University, who was my first human resources professor. And I really fell in love with the study. I fell in love with the field. And I also think he did a good job of saying this isn't all about just loving people. It's also about doing the hard stuff that leads to people being more effective. And so really knew that that's what I wanted to do. My first job in human resources, I was fortunate enough to work at USAA, Financial Services Organization in San Antonio. And I was so fortunate to go there because they had a very large HR organization. And so I had the ability to work as a specialist in the learning arena. Then I actually was an instructor for what we called HR boot camp at the time, where it really gave in-depth learning on all aspects of the HR field for our HR professionals there. Had some leadership experience there, helped develop a manager candidate school to help prepare managers in the organization. And so that broad experience at a company that is excellent and had excellent HR professionals was really so important, I think, to my overall HR career. When we relocated to Waco, I worked at a smaller bank here in Central Texas, CHRO Banks, and had the opportunity to work in a much smaller HR function, but still got to use a lot of those skills just for a smaller population and for a population that hadn't had some of the learning pieces that we had done, some of the other pieces that we worked on. After being there 7 years, my alma mater, of course, is Baylor, and I met often with the Vice President of Human Resources at Baylor at that point. We were both working to change our organizations to help further our HR organizations. And so he had approached me about joining the HR team at Baylor, and I did. And shortly after I got there, he left. And so after a few transitions, I ultimately became the CHRO at Baylor and have been there now 6 years. And so I think throughout that, started in an organization that had lots of different aspects of HR to watch and to see and experience, and then have also tried to be anyway agile enough to apply that experience in different environments.
So I was a graduate of Santa Clara University, and I thought I was going to take my career immediately into the world of education. But I did not, landing my first job with a company called Audia at the time, doing on-site Cisco recruiting and headhunting placement for them. And I knew pretty early on that I wasn't going to be destined to be a recruiter. While I liked it, I was interested in learning more about other aspects of HR, and I was recruited by a company called Telogy in Menlo Park to join their team in a more holistic, get your hands dirty in all the different avenues of HR. So I started out as a HR coordinator for them, learning about benefits, compensation, employee relations, events. There's so many different events in human resources. We never even think about that side of the house. And from there, I followed my boss actually to Riverstone Networks, worked with her as her benefits manager and lead there for 7.5 years, ultimately becoming vice president of Riverstone after she left. Worked there through an IPO, very exciting time, and then ultimately an acquisition by Lucent Technologies. I left Lucent after the acquisition and had been offered a role with them, but decided pretty quickly that I'm not a big company HR professional. I like to really be in touch with the employees and be able to make difference in people's lives. So I left and decided to take a year off with my children. And it only lasted 10 days before I was called by Yodlee, and where I spent 12.5 years as their director and ultimately vice president of human resources for Yodlee, doing an IPO and eventually an acquisition by Envestnet. I left them, did take an official hiatus, year off work, and I just joined Ariaka Networks as their CHRO about 100 days ago.
It's so interesting, I feel like, to dive into this series, the CHRO series. This role is, I could do this all day. The CHRO, their role in the organization is growing, it's changing, and it is more closely connecting our senior HR leaders to the strategy and operations of the overall business and how it works with the rest of the company as well as the leadership team. I love hearing these stories about how these HR leaders got their start in HR and how it led them to that CHRO role. There are so many ways to grow in your HR career. I am inspired by these stories. I hope that you are too. Thank you to Daily Pay and Ginger.com for powering this CHRO series. And thank you to our podcast sponsors for Workology, Upskill HR, and Ace the HR exam. personal and professional development is essential for successful HR leaders. Join Upskill HR to access live training, community, and over 100 on-demand courses for the dynamic leader. HR Research credits available. Visit upskillhr.com for more. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. My name is Jessica Miller-Merrell, and until next time, you can visit Workology.com to listen to all our Workology podcast episodes.